Got a recording notification. Are we there?
I think we're running with it.
Hello, world.
Hello, world.
This is like how I should maybe start every podcast or something. I don't know. Anyway, so we're doing this AMA thing largely because one of the things that keeps coming up in my conversations is, hey, I've never seen anybody that had a similar opinion to me on this, or I never had the opportunity to talk about this with somebody else in the design system space. And so I think a big part of the challenge with that is trying to figure out how to surface a lot of the conversations that we have inside of Knapsack to a bunch of people in the outside world. And so invited Evan to chat, to a quick question and answer around a lot of stuff that I've been running into in terms of design systems. And given this is our first one, it's kind of a tryout. But I wanted to talk about a couple of sort of origin story things for a minute, and then there's a few conversations I've had just this week that have been really exciting. And so, kind of starting with the origin side of it, one of the things that has been so exciting about working at Knapsack with Evan is getting to watch the stuff that we talked about circa 2015, 2016 start to actually be real inside of our application, inside of our customers. And I remember in those very early days, one of the things that we would always talk about before we even really knew what the word design systems meant, because remember we were calling it like component driven development and all these other different ideas, right? Was this notion of don't repeat yourself. And that notion of don't repeat yourself being the preeminent way of talking about how broken the process was of creating digital applications. I'm curious, Evan, from your perspective, like, does that dry message, the don't repeat yourself context still really, like, is that the guiding thing still? And what else has kind of changed in the way that you talk about this stuff from when we got started?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, there have always been, well, not always, but there have been these, principles for how to kind of make software that scales, not repeating yourself, having a single source of truth, certain kind of like principles like, the modularity encapsulation, like giving pieces of like the software systems each like jobs, but being a little ignorant of each other. There's like things like that like I think kind of were known by like back end a long time ago, if you will. And I think that it had been front enders kind of starting to use those as we started to get the tools, because at first we had to just write HTML everywhere. We had like, all right, we have like reusable chunks of templates, and I think React kind of popularized a lot of that kind of stuff, and basically made it so you're like, oh yeah, like the button is modular and reusable, ignorant of where it's being used, and then that that makes things really flexible. And I think that stuff continues to go down over to like even like design as well, where they're like, okay, like this is the button for all the places. So there's just kind of some thoughts about those like original principles. And I believe your second question is thoughts that have evolved. I would say the big one for me is, back then it was this big debate of where this source of truth was. Was it in design or code? And the big change there is it shifting over to, the source of truth is what end users actually experience. It's more about like what users are experiencing is, how people perceive your brand. So that was a big shift for me.
Yeah, there was an interesting kind of topic that we hit on early on where we used to talk about like the battle for the DOM, right? Like who's in control of what actually ends up getting rendered in front of a user. And the futility of the source of truth argument became pretty readily apparent after we got started building Knapsack, where that we talked about it first in terms of like, well, code is the source of truth, and then we talked about it in terms of like, well, the truth migrates from design to code depending on where things are at any given time. And we like the funny conversation about truth loops and like whether or not that was a good cereal brand. But then even getting in now to where we're at, where when we talk about central source of truth, because everybody has their own tooling and their own place of working, that usually isn't the design system itself. There's usually like stuff happening in Figma, but it's related to the design system. Or there's stuff happening in VS Code, but that's related to the design system. And so that ability to aggregate all this disaggregated truth became a real kind of foundational concept for us. And then ultimately, I think that the thing that we settled on that has been pretty immutable is get as close to the medium that something's destined for as fast as possible. And that's one of those things that when we talk at Knapsack about like changing the way we think about building digital products, like that's what we really mean is start to get as close as we can to the end user state as quickly as we can.
Yeah, I think there it is about, iteration, right? And so what you want to be able to do is to see how something will work as accurately as possible. So that's where the medium it's destined for comes into play. And so you want to make sure that you're not just looking at like a picture of what the website would look like. You are actually getting to use it, and you want to be able to experience that, and then have anybody inside the org that's building it, be able to give feedback on it and make it better a little bit. I remember plenty of times where working with a designer where they had a hard time, like when it came to like animations, they couldn't do animations in their design tool. And so, we would get it, actually running in a web browser, and they would play with it and they would just say a little faster or a little slower, and then, okay, little simple change, I remember another project where the animations were given to me in like Adobe After Effects. And I was like, wow, that, those iteration loops were really long and costly versus basically
it's a lot
having
of work to get a fade to work,
Yeah. Versus like how quick you could iterate when you have a conversation across disciplines, like a designer and a developer working together. That is, it's quick. It doesn't cost a lot, and you can do lots of little experiments and feedback and iterations. And I think that's how you ultimately get a better end result.
So this actually is a good segue into one of the other things that I was curious about is, when we were having a conversation on the design systems field guide earlier this week, one of the things that we talked about was some questions about how people are using Figma and how people are using dev mode. And in particular, Dan Moll's piece that stuck out about how the reality is the more time we spend in Figma, the less time we're actually, building software. And I think that's paraphrasing. So again, I think I said this caveat earlier this week too, like Dan, go look it up. It's not actually that, but it's something akin to that statement. So when we think about this idea of what the future of design tools are, you talked about something like animation, right? Which is actually shockingly difficult to still model inside of design tools in a way that actually can get built as code. Beyond just animation, there's lots of other things, right? Like if we're able to use code to rapidly iterate and to rapidly create in a way that doesn't require you to actually understand how the underlying code itself works, what are the future of design tools, in your opinion? Do we even need them?
Well, I'm going to answer this in two parts. First, I'm going to basically say that I think that, design tools as kind of like a planning tool are great. I mean, I don't think that when you have a blank canvas, you should just start with a blank web page and like, you know, have like a div with a border. Like you need a spot to be able to experiment there. And but once you have a, you know, a critical mass, you should probably iterate in that like medium it's actually running. And so that's kind of the first thing I wanted to say there. And then the second would be basically like, all right, if you have a critical mass of components, do you even need like the design tools anyway? I think that, yeah, because like, you know, the place to like plan and design and create the new components, you know, I think can totally start in Figma, etc. I think that what we'll probably see less and less of is full page like composition, and especially like, you know, user journeys through multiple pages, especially with like very interactive, like, I mean, even something as simple as an accordion opening and closing, but it could get a lot more complicated than that. Just because there's like a lot of like wasted time, it's like a lot of overhead. And if you've already got those components, it's not too hard to put them together in those pages. And that's why we have the components, right? Those little building blocks. So you may as well build it in the medium it's destined for, because you're going to get better feedback. And then you'll be able to like take that feedback and change it, you know, in the source that will actually get experienced by users, code, which makes the websites, versus throwing it right back into like the planning comps to like go through, and you still got to go through like code to get to what users experience. So yeah, once you have those components going though, I think that there's a lot that can be done in the medium it's destined for.
So talk to me a little bit more about composability and how that's empowering this, right? I like you believe in this very democratized future where anybody should be able to create with code, and composability ends up being key to this. And so when I talk about composability, I mean the ability to take a bunch of smaller componentry and assemble it into a more complete, robust experience. Talk to me about how you think that's enabling this future or hindering it.
It's very important. I mean, you know, no one should make a, you know, a my address form. You should probably have several text fields. Maybe there's like a, you know, I was about to say maybe there should be a state dropdown, but it's really a, you know, a dropdown with states as content. So I guess my point there is that there's, why would you make all of these like specific use cases, you know, like the contact form, a profile form, you know, address form, when you have like the bits and pieces together anyway? So yeah, composability is like super important there. And I think that it's interesting because the people who are making the designs have to kind of like let go a little bit, you know, because you never know how your stuff is going to get used. And so, and I think it's both terrifying and awesome, you know, to kind of like, if you ever make something and you find somebody who made something with your things in a way that like even delights you, that's probably got to be like one of the most exciting things as like a creator. So likewise, you know, there's the inverse of that, of the, oh my God, they're using it like that. That was not what I was thinking at all, part. So I think that, you know, it's better than it isn't. And I think that like there's a lot of ways you can be able to set up kind of some like good guardrails. I think guidelines go a long way there. But yeah, I think it's stuff is super important. Little Legos everywhere, right?
Just a one big bucket of Legos. Hopefully
Everyone's favorite analogy when it comes to design systems.
So I was talking to PJ Onari, who used to run the Gestalt Pinterest design system, and one of the things that he was talking about is how he still views a fundamental difference between design and engineering. And his take as a designer was we're often too precious about our work. Coders are creatives, albeit in a different way than designers are. But coders innately expect that either a human or a machine is going to significantly change the code that they first submit, either from an automated process like linting rules or something like that, to a peer PR review, making comments and edits. And so the expectation as a developer is creating something is that it's going to change. It's not existent in its final form. Whereas his point on the design side of things is we have this preciousness to the things that we create and design. This is like, this is the beautiful thing I created. The thing that ultimately ends up in front of users needs to look just like this, or feel just like this, or experience just like this. And his point was there's a bit of fiction there that we tell ourselves in the design process that says this thing that we make is immutable and can't change or shouldn't change. And I think this gets to a lot of the core of design systems concepts is just like you were saying, you have to let go a little bit of that preciousness to realize that the thing that you're creating is then going to be used by other people in a composable way to create a final experience. I'm curious, like, what lessons like really speak to you in that statement? Is it that as somebody who is spent most of their life creating with code, do you view that there is either a parallel or an inverse to that statement about design?
Yeah, there's a couple things. So I heard a good quote once that it was like, all the designers want is like their vision of experience to, get to the end users. And, they have their frustrations that they have to, that it gets filtered or diluted as it goes through like the developers, and you take a look at a lot of designers' portfolios and they're links to comps and not links to actual websites, and I think that a designer, if their vision still kind of like stood that like production process and it was still there, I think they'd be very proud because, you can hand a designer a designer can hand an engineer like 12 comps and then there's 1,200 pages. So it actually like scales up in like a really beautiful way. So I guess what I'm trying to say there is that like it has the potential to be more proud of like what those end users got to experience. And I don't think that it's basically, okay, so how does it get diluted, right? Is it because engineers are sloppy? Is it because they're rushed? Is it because they like don't care? Is it because the things designed were planned? I think that it's sometimes it might be like that plan doesn't, work in that medium, right? I mean, like where something can work in a podcast, it might not work in a movie, right? The medium is just different, right? And so I think it gets back to that first point.
Might not work in a podcast.
We'll find out. Yeah. I think that, to get back to that first part is rapid iteration after experiencing it in the medium it's destined for. So I think that when that is done, I think that, the designers would be able to say, yes, my vision did, withstand that translation process. End users are experiencing what I wanted them to experience, right? Because, it would have gone from that, like the designer's mind to like Figma to, the components in a website. They would have experienced it, been like, okay, a little to the left, gone through it again. And then you just keep doing that like feedback loop. And then you're going to end up getting something, a lot better than if they would have made something like, in isolation by themselves.
Yeah, and I think that is the interesting knock-on effect to this, right? Because there is so much vision that designers and design teams have, and there is collaboration within that team very frequently, but it's rare to see collaboration between that team. Now, it's more present probably now than it's ever been. Like, we always used to joke like designers on like floor 14 and developers are in like sub basement 2. Now there's a lot more people, at least like, I don't know, maybe sitting on the 6th floor together or something like that to torture that a little bit. But the idea of this cross-functional collaboration improving the end work product because of the diversity of opinion, but also the diversity of understanding constraints.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. What are the constraints? And constraints often are looked at as something that limits, but I think it actually focuses. And I think that there's actually a lot of creativity about like what can be done within like the constraints. So, I mean, one example is, I don't know, page load speed, right? You know, like being able to not load up the page with every possible thing actually kind of is good because it kind of focuses the message to the end users as well. So I think that people should not look at the constraints as a limiting thing. And there's a lot of like beauty to, you know, the nice solution within the constraints.
Yeah, another thing that you can think about is like color, right? You know, should you use 12 million colors on your website? Probably not. You should probably use like, you know, somewhere between 5 and 20.
Yeah, exactly. Like that the constraints of like pick between the colors from the design tokens creates a cohesion which builds trust with the user, right? And so there's another good example.
Yeah, and you know that idea of a design system constrains my ability to be creative. I definitely don't think that's necessarily true. I was giving this example earlier, right, where my 6-year-old was asking me, uh, uh, "Dad, why do we use the same deck of cards every time?" And he's like, don't you end up just he was complaining about my shuffling in a game we were playing. He's like, I got the same hand as I did last time. I was like, no, you didn't, first of all. But secondly, like, how many hands do you think are possible? And he's like, I don't know. Like, I imagine if we played this for an hour or two, like, I'd end up with the same cards a lot. I was like, you know, there's like over a billion ways to shuffle a 52 deck of cards. And I was like, we could play a different hand every single time for your entire life and not end up having the same set of hands twice. And it blew his mind.
Or
Just
you could get the same hand
options.
back to back.
Yep.
Yeah, it's not like, you know, the classic thing, right? If you roll a dice 6 times, you're not going to get each number. Probability.
Exactly. Well, anyway, this has been a fun first experiment. I really appreciate you jumping on and chatting. I love to have our conversations that we tend to do, usually over beers, and be able to like actually put that out in the world. So thanks for coming, Evan.
Yeah, I always love talking shop, Chris.
You have anything for me before we break? I got like time for one, maybe.
Does it still surprise you that vastly different companies come across the same challenges in this space?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I did sales for long enough where there's all the salesperson memes of like every company thinks that they're wildly different, but none of them actually are. The amount of times that you hear as somebody on the business side of the house, well, you know, we're special, or well, you know, we're a little bit different. The reality is like the product or the thing you're serving or the thing you're building might be a little bit different, but it's the same creative process to get there. That is fraught with the same problems. And so for me, at least, when I think about like what's different system to system to system, I think about like kind of 3 breakpoints, right? Building systems for marketing is different than building systems for products. And then building systems for internal teams to consume is very different than building systems for external teams to consume. And so if you're, you know, Material or Lightning or one of the other things where you're trying to empower a bunch of users that you may not ever talk to, your design system is sort of a product in a real sense, instead of just calling it a product. And I think that that's a pretty stark difference. But beyond those 3 buckets, it's all a lot of like small variations. It's all props in a component instead of a different pattern itself. So yeah, that's kind of how I see it.
Nice. Yeah, it's an old adage, right? We're all a lot more similar than we are different.
Definitely. Awesome. Well, hey, thanks for joining. This has been great.
Yeah.
Lindsay, are you still around? You want to jump back in and tell people when the next one of these is going to be? Oh no, she's on mute too. right. Well, we can't hear Lindsay. We'll put some out in the chat and say something about it later. Thanks for bearing with us on this first one, y'all.
Yeah.
And looking forward to many more of these in the future. Thanks again.
Yeah. Have a good day, y'all.